Rain poured relentlessly outside the Belmont Grand, the most prestigious hotel in the city. Sheets of water cascaded down the ornate granite facade, transforming the building's intricate carvings into weeping figures. The storm had arrived suddenly, sending pedestrians scurrying for shelter and turning the normally bustling downtown streets into glistening, empty corridors. Luxury vehicles pulled beneath the hotel's covered entrance, where uniformed valets rushed forward with oversized umbrellas to shield the arriving guests from nature's inconvenience. Inside, 15 crystal chandeliers, each worth more than what most people earned in a year, cast their warm glow across polished marble floors that reflected light like mirrors. The lobby stretched upward for 3 majestic stories, its perimeter lined with Italian marble columns and antique furnishings upholstered in rich burgundy velvet. The elegant space hummed with the quiet conversations of the wealthy and powerful, those who belonged in such rarefied surroundings. Banking executives, real estate moguls, visiting dignitaries, people accustomed to doors opening before they reached for the handle, to rooms falling silent when they spoke. It was a sanctuary of luxury, where even the air seemed filtered to a higher quality than the world outside, scented with subtle notes of sandalwood and citrus. Through the revolving doors came Emily Jackson, a black woman in her early 30s. Water droplets clung to the shoulders of her navy blue dress, impeccably tailored Valentino that accentuated her athletic yet elegant frame. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated updo, not a strand out of place despite the weather's assault. Her skin glowed like polished amber under the warm lighting. Diamond studs, modest but authentic, adorned her ears, and a thin gold chain encircled her neck, bearing a small pendant in the shape of a balance scale, a nod to her legal career. Despite her composed exterior, there was a slight hesitation in her step, a guardedness in her eyes that came from experience. This was not her first encounter with places that silently questioned her presence, not her first time feeling the weight of unspoken assessments and assumptions. She had developed a sixth sense for detecting the subtle shift in atmosphere that often accompanied her entrance into predominantly white, wealthy spaces. She approached the reception desk with practiced poise, her smile polite but reserved, her shoulders squared with a dignity that had been hard-earned through years of similar encounters. The staff behind the marble counter exchanged quick glances, a subtle choreography of silent communication that Emily had observed countless times before. Their smiles remained professional, plastic and practiced, but their eyes held questions, assumptions. The blonde receptionist, whose name tag read Jessica, allowed her gaze to linger a beat too long on Emily's designer handbag, as if mentally calculating whether it was authentic. The male clerk beside her straightened almost imperceptibly, his customer service smile tightening at the corners. Emily had seen this look countless times before, that momentary calculation, the subtle shift in posture that suggested surprise at her appearance in such an establishment. The microaggressions were so familiar they had become almost predictable. The slight delay in service, the marginally cooler tone, the barely perceptible once, over that assessed her worthiness to occupy the space. Still, she maintained her dignity as she waited to be acknowledged, mentally rehearsing the words she would use, articulate and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding or dismissal. After 15 seconds that stretched like minutes, Jessica finally addressed her with a tone that hovered in the uncomfortable space between professional and patronizing. "Can I help you?" The question carried an unspoken second half. "With finding your way out?" Emily responded with the voice she'd perfected in courtrooms and lecture halls, melodious yet authoritative, warm yet unmistakably educated. "Good evening. I was wondering if you could direct me to the Sapphire Ballroom. I believe there's an event scheduled there tomorrow night." She deliberately didn't mention her connection to the event yet, having learned from experience that establishing her legitimacy too eagerly often backfired, making her appear defensive rather than confident. Jessica's fingers hovered over her computer keyboard, but before she could respond, a shadow fell across the counter. A middle-aged white man in a meticulously pressed charcoal suit approached with measured, deliberate steps. His silver-streaked hair was combed back with precision, not a strand daring to rebel against its assigned position. His complexion was ruddy from decades of expensive scotch, his posture radiating the particular brand of authority that comes not from earning respect but from expecting it as a birthright. A gold name tag, larger and more ornate than those worn by other staff, identified him as Richard Bennett, hotel manager. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter seas, narrowed slightly as they settled on Emily, assessing and dismissing her in the same moment. The receptionist immediately straightened, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something closer to wary attention. "Can I help you?" His tone was curt, lacking the warmth reserved for preferred guests. He positioned himself between Emily and the receptionist, effectively taking control of the interaction, his body language suggesting he was protecting his staff from an unwelcome intrusion. The subtle scent of expensive cologne, something with notes of cedar and bergamot, wafted from his immaculately pressed suit. He stood close enough to assert his dominance over the space, but far enough to maintain what he clearly considered appropriate distance. Richard Bennett had managed the Belmont Grand for 15 years, climbing from assistant manager to his current position through a combination of ruthless efficiency, political savvy, and an uncanny ability to make wealthy guests feel special. Under his leadership, the hotel had maintained its 5-star status and exclusive reputation. The Belmont's owner, a faceless investment group before the recent acquisition, had given him considerable autonomy, caring more about profits than methods. Richard had delivered consistently, keeping the Belmont Grand at the top of every luxury hotel ranking. He prided himself on knowing exactly who belonged in his establishment and who did not. In his mind, the hotel's exclusivity was its most valuable asset, and he considered himself its primary guardian. His thinly veiled contempt for those he deemed unworthy had never hindered his career. If anything, the ownership had always appreciated his ability to maintain the hotel's standards. Over the years, he had perfected the art of making certain guests feel unwelcome without saying anything explicitly offensive, nothing that could be quoted in a complaint or lawsuit. A slightly prolonged wait at check-in. A room with a less desirable view despite availability of better options. Service that was correct but cold, technically meeting requirements while subtly communicating second-class status. These were his subtle weapons, wielded with plausible deniability. The staff had learned to read his signals, to understand which guests merited the Belmont's legendary service and which could be treated with minimal effort. Most followed his lead without question, either sharing his biases or too concerned about their jobs to challenge him. The few who had attempted to treat all guests equally soon found themselves assigned to less desirable shifts or overlooked for promotions until they either conformed or left. Richard's system was efficient and, in his view, entirely justified. After all, the Belmont Grand wasn't for everyone. That was the point. "I was just asking about the Sapphire Ballroom," Emily repeated, maintaining eye contact despite the manager's intimidating stance. She didn't step back, didn't lower her gaze, small acts of resistance that did not go unnoticed by Richard. She had encountered men like him before, men who expected deference based solely on their position or appearance. Her refusal to be cowed clearly irritated him. A muscle twitched almost imperceptibly at the corner of his jaw. Richard's lips curled into what could technically be called a smile, though it contained no warmth. It was the kind of smile that served as a warning rather than a welcome. "The Sapphire Ballroom is hosting a private event. Invitation only." He emphasized the last two words with unmistakable meaning, his tone suggesting that such an invitation would certainly not be extended to someone like her. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken." He glanced meaningfully toward the exit, the suggestion clear, her presence was not required further. Emily felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the burn of indignation carefully contained by years of practice. As a black woman in predominantly white spaces, prestigious universities, corporate law firms, before she turned to academia, social events with her husband's business associates, she had developed an emotional callous against such treatment. Not because it hurt less, but because showing the hurt would only give men like Richard Bennett satisfaction. Instead, she reached into her Bottega Veneta purse, the motion deliberate and unhurried. "Actually, I wanted to confirm the details for tomorrow night's charity gala. My husband mentioned it was being held here, and I wanted to verify the time." Her tone remained even, dignified, her enunciation perfect, each word chosen to establish her legitimacy without appearing defensive. She had learned this delicate balance over years of similar encounters, how to assert her right to occupy space without triggering the fragile egos that often responded with escalation rather than acknowledgement. Richard's expression hardened, tiny wrinkles deepening around his eyes. The implication that she or her husband would be invited to such an event seemed to offend him personally. His eyes flicked dismissively over her, taking in her dress, her jewelry, her handbag, all of which screamed quality to the discerning eye, though he chose not to see it. His assessment had been made the moment she walked in, and no evidence would be permitted to challenge his conclusion. "There must be some confusion," he said, voice dripping with condescension, as if speaking to a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. "The Foundation Gala tomorrow is a very exclusive event. The guest list has been carefully curated." He picked up a glass of water from the counter, ostensibly for a sip, holding it with the affected delicacy of someone accustomed to handling fine crystal. "Perhaps you're thinking of a different hotel?" The suggestion was delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, cold and dismissive. Emily felt the familiar sting of these encounters, a sensation she had experienced throughout her life in upscale department stores where security guards followed her, at academic conferences where colleagues mistook her for support staff, in restaurants where she was seated near kitchens, despite empty tables by windows. Each incident carried its own flavor of humiliation, its own particular wound to her dignity. But years of experience had taught her to maintain composure, to deny people like Richard the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't ever let them see you sweat, baby. Your dignity isn't theirs to take." No confusion. "If you could just check your system," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. She didn't bother explaining that she wasn't merely invited to the gala. She and Michael had organized it, contributed $50,000, and invited half the guest list. Experience had taught her that offering too much information often appeared defensive, like she was trying to prove her worth. She refused to play that game. "I don't need to check anything," Richard interrupted, his patience visibly thinning, lips pressing into a tight line that whitened the skin around his mouth. His voice rose slightly, carrying to nearby guests. "I know every event in my hotel." The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them, his hotel, his domain, his rules. The implied message was clear. She was an interloper, attempting to breach a space where she didn't belong. Several guests in the opulent lobby had begun to take notice of the exchange. An older couple seated on a velvet settee glanced over, then quickly looked away, their discomfort evident. Two businessmen paused their conversation, one whispering something to the other that prompted a barely concealed smirk. A young woman at the concierge desk watched with undisguised interest, perhaps sensing the building tension. Most looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to witness the confrontation unfolding before them, while others watched with morbid curiosity, like spectators at an accident scene. The receptionists behind the counter shifted nervously, their eyes darting between Richard and each other, clearly aware of their manager's building anger but too intimidated to intervene. One young woman, whose name tag read Sophia, bit her lower lip anxiously, her brow furrowed in what might have been concern or disapproval. "My husband specifically mentioned the Belmont Grand," Emily persisted, her voice still calm but firmer now, refusing to be dismissed. She straightened almost imperceptibly, her full height still several inches shorter than Richard's, but her presence somehow expanding to match his. "His name is Michael Jackson. Perhaps you recognized." Something in Richard snapped. Perhaps it was her continued insistence, or perhaps it was the implication that he should recognize her husband's name, an indirect challenge to his authority and knowledge. In a motion that seemed to surprise even him, a flash of fury crossing his features before being replaced by cold satisfaction, he jerked his arm forward, sending the contents of his water glass directly into Emily's face with deliberate force. The water hit her with shocking coldness, a clear, freezing assault that splashed across her features with enough momentum to sting. It drenched her face, droplets clinging to her eyelashes, and cascading down her cheeks like forced tears. Rivulets traced paths down her neck and onto her collarbone, darkening the top of her dress with spreading stains. Her carefully applied makeup began to run, streaking her cheeks with faint traces of mascara. For a split second, the entire lobby froze in collective shock and disbelief, as if time itself had been suspended in the water's arc. The soft murmur of conversation ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete that the sound of water dripping onto the marble floor echoed like thunderclaps through the cavernous space. Emily stood perfectly still, water streaming down her face, her eyes closed momentarily against the assault. Her shoulders tensed, then consciously relaxed as she fought her body's instinctive response to the attack. The shock of the cold water gradually gave way to a deeper, more profound humiliation, not because she had done anything to deserve such treatment, but because her personhood had been so casually disregarded, her dignity assaulted for nothing more than asserting her right to exist in a space. When she opened her eyes, they held not rage or fear, but a deep, dignified pain, the kind that comes from having one's humanity denied yet again. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. With deliberate movements, she reached for her purse to retrieve a tissue, refusing to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her react with the anger he clearly hoped to provoke. Around them, the tableau of frozen observers began to thaw. A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly. One of the businessmen who had been smirking moments before now looked uncomfortable, his amusement transforming into something closer to shame. The older couple exchanged glances of disapproval, though whether directed at Richard or at the situation in general remained unclear. A bellhop standing near the entrance took half a step forward, then faltered, weighing his job security against his instinct to intervene. Richard himself seemed stunned by his own action. For a fleeting moment, concern flashed across his face as the potential consequences of his behavior dawned on him: professional repercussions, possible legal action, damage to the hotel's reputation. But pride quickly overcame any remorse. He straightened his jacket with a sharp tug, as if physically adjusting his moral stance along with his clothing. He stepped back, as if to distance himself from his deed, his face hardening into a mask of false authority. "Security," he called, voice slightly unsteady but attempting authority, gesturing toward two men in dark suits positioned discreetly near the entrance. "Please escort this woman out. She's disturbing our guests." The command hung in the air, weighted with the presumption that his authority would be unquestioningly obeyed, as it had been countless times before. The security guards stationed near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. One younger, with close-cropped dark hair, took a hesitant step forward, then paused, clearly conflicted about the situation. The other older, more experienced, remained stationary, his expression carefully neutral but his reluctance evident. They had been trained to handle disruptive guests, intoxicated patrons, even the occasional celebrity stalker, but this situation fell into no familiar category. Emily stood silent and dignified, despite her dripping face, while Richard's aggressive action had been witnessed by dozens of guests. The power dynamics were unclear, the appropriate response uncertain. Before they could decide how to proceed, however, the hotel's massive front doors swung open with a rush of wind that sent the velvet drapes billowing inward. The dramatic entrance seemed orchestrated by fate itself, perfectly timed to the unfolding drama. Conversations that had begun to resume now died again as attention shifted to the newcomer framed in the doorway. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 30s entered with a presence that instantly commanded attention. His custom-tailored black suit, clearly from one of London's finest Savile Row establishments, contrasted sharply with a deep blue tie that exactly matched Emily's dress, a detail that wouldn't be lost on careful observers. His gait was unhurried but purposeful, each step conveying absolute confidence. Rain droplets glistened on the shoulders of his wool overcoat, which he shrugged off with a fluid motion as he stepped into the lobby's warmth. His features were strong and defined, high cheekbones, a square jaw softened by a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that missed nothing. This was a man accustomed to authority, to being heard when he spoke, to having his decisions respected without question. This was Michael Jackson, though not the one known for moonwalking across stages, but rather for moving strategically through boardrooms, orchestrating business deals that regularly made the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. Michael's eyes scanned the lobby with the quick assessment of someone trained to read rooms, to gauge atmospheres, to identify allies and obstacles. Within seconds, they found Emily, still standing there with water dripping from her face, tissue clutched forgotten in her hand. His expression transformed from confusion to understanding, to controlled fury in the span of heartbeats, the micro-expressions so rapid they were barely perceptible. The lobby, already silent, seemed to grow even quieter, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The hotel staff straightened reflexively, recognizing power even before identifying its source. Jessica, who had been frozen in place behind the reception counter, suddenly seemed to remember her customer service training, stepping forward with a nervous smile that flickered on and off like a faulty light. The security guards, relieved of their immediate dilemma, relaxed marginally but remained alert, sensing that the situation had only grown more complex. Richard Bennett, however, merely saw another unwelcome presence at least initially. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening in preparation for what he anticipated would be another confrontation to manage. The smug satisfaction that had briefly crossed his features after dousing Emily with water was replaced by renewed irritation, unaware that his professional life was balanced on a precipice. Michael strode directly to Emily, his focus absolute, as if no one else in the lobby existed. He removed a handkerchief from his breast pocket with a smooth, practiced motion. With surprising gentleness for hands that had just been clenched in anger, he dabbed the water from her face. His touch tender but his eyes blazing with barely contained rage. The contrast between his gentle ministrations and the fury evident in his rigid jawline created a powerful tableau of restrained emotion. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice pitched for her ears alone. The simple question carried layers of meaning between a couple who had weathered similar storms together before. She nodded slightly, her composure remarkable, under the circumstances. "I'm fine," she whispered back, a response that both acknowledged and transcended the situation. A silent communication passed between them, years of marriage distilled into a glance that conveyed both her strength and his understanding. Only then did Michael turn to face Richard Bennett, pivoting with the deliberate motion of a predator shifting attention to its prey. The contrast between the two men was striking and immediately apparent to everyone in the lobby. Where Richard's authority came from his position, a borrowed power that could be stripped away, Michael's emanated from within a core of self-assurance that needed no external validation. Richard wore his suit like armor, a protective shell. Michael wore his like a second skin, comfortable in both his clothing and his identity. The difference was subtle but unmistakable, and the balance of power in the room shifted accordingly. Would someone care to explain? Michael's voice was controlled but resonant enough to fill the entire lobby, each word enunciated with precision that reflected both education and deliberate restraint. Why my wife is standing here soaking wet? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer while simultaneously making it clear that no explanation could possibly be adequate. Several guests who had been pretending not to watch the unfolding drama now abandoned all pretense, turning fully to witness what promised to be a fascinating confrontation between two forces of clearly unequal magnitude. Richard's expression had already begun to shift, a dawning uncertainty creeping in as he registered the newcomer's confident bearing and the deference automatically accorded to him by the staff. The first seeds of doubt began to germinate in his mind, though his pride remained too entrenched to yield completely. Still, old habits die hard, and his instinct was to maintain the upper hand, to assert his authority within the domain he had controlled for so long. "Sir, this woman was creating a disturbance." "I was simply," he began, his tone still carrying traces of condescension, though notably less pronounced than when addressing Emily. "Her name," Michael interrupted, the two words falling like hammer blows, brooking no continuation until the correction was acknowledged, "is Emily Jackson." "Dr. Emily Jackson, professor of constitutional law at Hamilton University." "And you haven't answered my question." The titles were not offered as justifications for respect, but as rebukes for the disrespect, already shown pointed reminders that Richard had misjudged badly in every possible way. The title seemed to give Richard pause, but only briefly. A flicker of recalculation crossed his features as he adjusted his approach, though not his fundamental position. There was a misunderstanding. His voice had modulated to a more conciliatory tone, though the underlying dismissal remained. She insisted on information about a private event to which she claimed to have some connection. When I explained that wasn't possible, she became argumentative. The lie flowed smoothly, years of practice in deflecting blame evident in his delivery. Several witnesses in the lobby exchanged glances, clearly disturbed by this mischaracterization. An older gentleman in a tailored suit made a small sound of disagreement. A young receptionist behind the counter opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, fear overriding honesty. Emily remained silent, allowing Michael to handle the situation, her dignity intact, despite the water still dripping from her chin onto the marble floor. "A misunderstanding," Michael repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. Each syllable was infused with skepticism. "And that justifies throwing water in my wife's face?" The question was delivered calmly, but with an underlying current of danger, like the deceptive stillness above a powerful undertow. Richard's composure began to crack visibly now, hairline fractures appearing in his confident facade. "It was an accident." The glass slipped. He gestured vaguely, as if the motion itself might lend credence to his transparent fabrication. "It didn't slip," came a voice from behind the reception counter. All eyes turned to a young woman whose name tag read Sophia. She stood with hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with tension, her delicate features set in an expression of nervous determination. She was trembling slightly, but stood her ground, something in Michael's dignified anger having catalyzed her own courage. "It wasn't an accident, sir. Mr. Bennett deliberately threw the water at your wife when she mentioned your name." Richard shot her a venomous look, a silent promise of retribution that made the young woman flinch but not retract her statement. The damage was done. Murmurs spread through the watching crowd, and several other guests nodded in agreement with Sophia's statement. The collective witnessing, making it impossible for Richard to maintain his lie. Sensing his position weakening, Richard attempted to regain control through aggression, a tactic that had served him well in the past. His posture stiffened, chin lifting in defiance. "Who exactly are you?" he demanded of Michael, voice hardening, as he made a final attempt to assert dominance in what he still considered his territory. "And what gives you the right to question how I manage this hotel?" The emphasis on "my" was subtle but unmistakable, a last desperate claim to authority. A ghost of a smile touched Michael's lips, not reaching his eyes, which remained cold and focused. It was the smile of someone who has just been dealt the winning hand in a high-stakes game. "You don't recognize me." The question was mild, conversational almost, yet it carried a weight that caused Richard's confidence to waver visibly. For the first time, uncertainty fully registered on Richard's face. He scrutinized Michael more carefully, searching his memory for where he might have encountered this man before. Something vaguely familiar tickled at the edges of his recollection, perhaps a photograph in a business publication or at a hospitality industry event. His eyes narrowed in concentration, the first tendrils of genuine concern beginning to work their way into his consciousness. 3 months ago, Meridian Hospitality Group acquired this hotel chain, Michael said evenly, each word measured and precise. The purchase was featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and every major hospitality industry publication. He paused, allowing the information to register fully. "I'm Michael Jackson, CEO and majority shareholder of Meridian." The blood drained from Richard Bennett's face, so rapidly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His complexion, previously flushed with authority and indignation, turned a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His hands, previously gesticulating with confidence, now hung limply at his sides. Around them, the lobby erupted in whispers that spread like wildfire from guest to guest, staff member to staff member. Hotel employees stood frozen in place, some with expressions of shock, others with poorly concealed satisfaction at witnessing the downfall of a feared and resented figure. Michael wasn't just a guest. He wasn't just wealthy. He was, effectively, the owner of the entire establishment. Every painting on the wall, every chandelier, every piece of furniture, and Richard Bennett's career all fell under his authority. The realization hit Richard, with the force of a physical blow, visible in the way his shoulders suddenly slumped as if the weight of his mistake had become a tangible burden. I had no idea, Mr. Jackson. If I'd known who you were, Richard stammered, panic replacing his previous arrogance, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to salvage what was rapidly becoming an unsalvageable situation. If you'd known who I was, Michael cut him off, his voice taking on an edge that had been carefully controlled until now, you would have treated me with respect. But you shouldn't need to know who I am to treat another human being with basic dignity. His voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the calm, a controlled anger more powerful than any shouting could have been. The fact that your behavior would change based on my identity only makes this worse, not better. The truth of Michael's words seemed to reverberate through the lobby, touching something fundamental in those who heard them. Several staff members looked down, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in similar situations, times when they had calibrated their respect based on perceived status, rather than inherent humanity. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, possibly reflecting on their own behavior in other contexts. Emily, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed lobby. This isn't about us, Richard. It's about a pattern. How many others have you treated this way when you thought they didn't belong here? The question wasn't accusatory, but reflective, inviting consideration, rather than defensiveness, the voice of a professor, accustomed to challenging students to examine their own assumptions. Richard's eyes darted around the lobby, seeking allies but finding none. Staff members who had once scurried to do his bidding now avoided his gaze. Guests who might have sympathized with his maintenance of standards just minutes ago now watched his humiliation with the detached interest of those observing a cautionary tale unfold. The power he had wielded so confidently minutes before had evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, a king suddenly revealed to be wearing no clothes. Mr. Bennett, Michael said, addressing him formally now, the shift in title a subtle indication of the changed power dynamic. I've actually been receiving reports about your management style for several weeks. Guest complaints, staff concerns. I was planning to address them during my visit this week. He paused, his gaze unwavering. But it seems you've made that conversation much simpler. The revelation that he had already been under scrutiny seemed to hit Richard like a second blow. His already pale complexion grew even more ashen, the realization that his position had been precarious even before this incident clearly registering in his widened eyes and slightly parted lips. He attempted to regain his composure, straightening his tie and shoulders with trembling fingers, a reflexive effort to reclaim some semblance of dignity. Mr. Jackson, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding. If we could discuss this privately, he suggested, desperation evident in his slightly higher pitch, a final attempt to contain the damage, to remove his humiliation from public view. No, Michael's response was immediate and firm, leaving no room for negotiation. There will be no private discussion. You didn't humiliate my wife privately. You didn't discriminate privately. Why should the consequences be private? The rhetorical question hung in the air, unanswerable. Michael's tone made it clear that this was not merely about retribution but about justice, about addressing publicly what had been perpetrated publicly. The entire staff of the Belmont Grand seemed to be holding their breath. From the maintenance workers who had paused their tasks to observe the unfolding drama to the executive chef who had emerged from the restaurant, his white coat immaculate, everyone waited for what would come next. The air was charged with anticipation, with the collective recognition that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the hotel's history. Richard Bennett, Michael's voice carried throughout the space without him raising it, a skill honed in countless boardrooms. You're fired. Effective immediately. The simplicity of the statement belied its impact. For 15 years, Richard had been the unquestioned authority within these walls. His word had been final, his position secure. And in a single sentence, it was gone. In an instant, he had been transformed from the powerful arbiter of others' worth to a man without status, without authority, without a place in the hierarchy he had once dominated. "You can't," Richard began, but the protest died on his lips, the words evaporating as he confronted the irrefutable reality of his situation. Of course Michael could. And he just had. The finality of it seemed to physically diminish him, his shoulders slumping further, his previously commanding presence shrinking before the eyes of all present. "Security," Michael called to the same guards Richard had attempted to summon earlier, his tone firm but not unkind. They were, after all, simply employees following orders. "Please escort Mr. Bennett to his office to collect his personal belongings. Then see him out of the building." There was no vindictiveness in the instruction, just a calm finality that made it clear the decision was irreversible. The guards moved without hesitation, their allegiance instantly transferred to the true authority in the room. Richard's face contorted with humiliation, as he realized that the very staff he had lorded over were now witnesses to his downfall, that his journey through the hotel to collect his things would be a walk of shame observed by all. The security officers flanked him, not touching him but making it clear he had no choice but to comply. With a last desperate look around the lobby, as if seeking some intervention that would not come, Richard Bennett began his final walk through the empire he had ruled so absolutely just minutes before. As Richard was led away, something remarkable began to happen throughout the lobby. One by one, staff members moved to form a loose semicircle around Michael and Emily. It wasn't coordinated, wasn't orchestrated, no signal had been given, no instruction offered. Rather, it was a spontaneous gesture of solidarity and perhaps relief. Years of tension, of walking on eggshells around a mercurial and often biased manager, seemed to dissipate from their collective shoulders. Backs straightened, expressions softened. The atmosphere itself seemed to lighten, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Sophia, the receptionist who had spoken up, stepped forward from behind the counter. Her earlier nervousness had not entirely disappeared, but determination now outweighed fear in her demeanor. "Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Jackson, on behalf of the staff, I want to apologize for what happened. Not all of us agreed with how Mr. Bennett operated the hotel." Her voice wavered slightly, the admission clearly difficult after years of enforced complicity. Emily reached out and gently squeezed the young woman's hand, a gesture of female solidarity that transcended their different positions. "Thank you for speaking the truth. That takes courage." The simple acknowledgement brought tears to Sophia's eyes, a recognition of the risk she had taken and the values it represented. Another staff member, an older bellman with salt and pepper hair and deeply lined features that spoke of decades of service, stepped forward. His uniform was impeccably maintained, his posture military straight despite his years. "Mr. Bennett has been treating guests like that for years, sir. Especially guests of color. Some of us tried to report it, but..." He trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging in the air, "but we weren't heard, weren't believed, or were too afraid to persist." "But you were afraid for your jobs," Michael finished for him, his tone understanding rather than accusatory. "I understand." And he did. As a black man who had climbed to the top of an industry not known for its diversity, navigating boardrooms where he was often the only person of color, he understood all too well how power could be wielded to silence, how economic vulnerability could enforce complicity. The bellman nodded, gratitude for the understanding evident in his eyes. "That changes today," Michael continued, addressing the gathered staff, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby without effort. "Meridian Hospitality Group has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind, whether directed at guests or staff members. This isn't just about public relations or legal liability, though those matter too. It's about creating spaces where everyone is treated with dignity." He paused, looking around at the assembled faces, making eye contact with as many as possible, ensuring they understood this wasn't just corporate rhetoric but a genuine commitment. The staff listened attentively, many nodding in agreement or exchanging glances of cautious optimism. There was a palpable sense of weight being lifted, of a new beginning, of possibilities previously unimagined suddenly within reach. "Starting tomorrow," Michael continued, his tone shifting from admonishment to vision, from addressing the past to building the future, "we'll be implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff. Additionally, we'll be establishing clear reporting channels for any incidents of discrimination, with protections for those who speak up." He paused, looking around at the assembled faces, employees of all levels who had been shaped by the culture Richard Bennett had created. "The Belmont Grand should be a place of excellence in every respect, including how we treat people. All people, regardless of race, gender, or any other factor." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the staff and many of the guests. It wasn't just approval of Michael's words. It was relief, a collective exhale after years of tension. a recognition that something fundamental had changed for the better. The applause grew, spreading through the lobby like a wave, washing away the remnants of the ugly scene that had preceded it. Some staff members had tears in their eyes, others exchanged smiles that held a new warmth, a new camaraderie forged in this moment of transformation. As the immediate drama subsided, hotel operations began to resume. The acting assistant manager stepped forward to temporarily take charge, issuing quiet instructions to ensure guests' needs continued to be met despite the upheaval. Staff returned to their posts with a new energy, a sense of purpose that had been missing under Richard's regime. Guests returned to their conversations, now with exciting new material to discuss over cocktails or dinner, a real-life drama more engaging than anything they might have streamed in their luxury suites. Michael guided Emily to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from curious eyes and well-meaning staff, who might have overwhelmed them with further apologies or expressions of support. They settled into a secluded alcove furnished with plush velvet armchairs, a small oasis of privacy within the public space. Now that they were somewhat sheltered from observation, Emily finally allowed herself to fully react to what had happened, the composed facade she had maintained beginning to show hairline fractures. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and Michael pulled her into a gentle embrace, his hand moving in slow, comforting circles on her back. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that," he murmured into her hair, his voice low and intimate, meant for her ears only. The words were inadequate, they both knew, but necessary nonetheless, an acknowledgement of hurt, of injustice witnessed and shared. Emily pulled back, wiping away a tear that had finally escaped her careful control. "It's not the first time, Michael. You know that." The simple statement contained volumes of shared history, of previous incidents weathered together throughout their 15-year relationship, from their early dating years through marriage and professional ascendancy. Which makes it worse, not better. His jaw tightened momentarily before he regained control, the brief flash of anger quickly contained. "I've suspected issues with this location since the acquisition." The guest satisfaction scores were consistently lower for certain demographics. Staff turnover was higher than at our other properties. The anonymous employee feedback raised red flags. He shook his head slightly, frustration evident in the gesture. "But I wanted to investigate thoroughly before making changes, gather concrete evidence rather than acting on suspicion." Emily nodded, understanding his methodical approach. It was part of what made him successful, this ability to balance decisive action with careful analysis. "Well, I suppose we conducted a rather dramatic field test." The quip was accompanied by a weak smile, her attempt to lighten the moment, to begin the process of transforming an ugly experience into something they could eventually move beyond. A small smile broke through Michael's serious expression in response, a reflexive reaction to her resilience. "Not how I would have chosen to confirm my suspicions." His expression grew serious again, the smile fading as quickly as it had appeared. "When Bennett threw that water at you, Emily, I nearly lost control." The admission was quiet, a confession of vulnerability rarely displayed in public. "I wanted to." He stopped himself, unwilling to verbalize the violent impulses that had momentarily flooded him, surprising in their intensity. She placed a hand on his cheek, the gesture tender and grounding. "But you didn't. You handled it perfectly. Professional but definitive. You showed power without ever raising your voice." There was pride in her tone, an acknowledgement of the difficult line he had walked. Michael had indeed navigated a razor's edge. As a black executive, he was acutely aware of the double standards at play. Express too much anger, and he'd be labeled aggressive or threatening harmful stereotypes that could undermine his authority and feed into racist narratives. Show too little response to his wife's mistreatment, and he'd appear weak, ineffectual. The balance required was exhausting, a burden white executives simply didn't face, an additional layer of calculation required in every professional interaction. "It wasn't just about us," Emily said softly, echoing what she had said to Richard earlier. Her voice took on the reflective quality that had made her such an effective professor, able to extract broader principles from specific incidents. "Think about all the people he's treated that way who didn't have the power to do anything about it. The ones who just had to absorb it and move on." Michael nodded grimly, his expression somber. "That's what keeps me up at night. For every discriminatory incident that happens to someone with the resources and position to fight back, there are hundreds that go unchallenged." The observation wasn't new between them, it was a recurring theme in their conversations, a shared understanding that shaped their approach to their respective roles in society. They both fell silent for a moment, contemplating this reality. It was the reason Emily had chosen constitutional law as her field, focusing particularly on equal protection cases. It was why Michael had built diversity initiatives into the foundation of his company, rather than treating them as add-on programs. They were both fighting the same battle, just on different fronts, using the platforms available to them to effect change where they could. "You know," Emily said finally, her voice lightening as she deliberately shifted to a more forward-looking perspective. "I came here simply to check on the setup for tomorrow's scholarship fundraiser." Hardly expected to become part of the evening's drama. The event they had organized was the annual gala for their foundation, which provided scholarships to underprivileged students pursuing careers in business and law. Michael's expression lightened slightly, following her lead away from the heaviness of the moment. "Well, I'd say the foundation's mission just got a very practical demonstration. Breaking barriers indeed." The foundation they had established 5 years ago was dedicated to providing educational opportunities to underrepresented minorities, with a particular focus on business and law fields, where both Michael and Emily had faced their own struggles against systemic biases and entrenched power structures. As they spoke, they noticed Richard Bennett being escorted through the lobby toward the exit, a cardboard box of personal items in his arms. The box seemed small to contain 15 years of career, a pitifully inadequate vessel for what had been his professional identity. His face was ashen, his previously commanding stride reduced to a shuffle. His eyes, once sharp with authority, now darted nervously from side to side, unable to meet the gazes of those he passed. Staff members who had once jumped at his commands, now watched impassively as he was marched out. Their expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity to simple relief. Richard's gaze met Emily's across the lobby. For a brief moment, something like shame flashed across his features, perhaps the first genuine emotion he had displayed throughout the entire encounter. Then it was gone, replaced by a hardening of his expression as he was led through the doors and into the rainy night, the glass revolving door spinning behind him like the closing scene of a morality play. "Do you think he'll learn from this?" Emily asked, watching the doors close behind him. The question wasn't merely rhetorical. As an educator, she believed genuinely in the possibility of growth, of transformation through difficult experience. Michael considered the question, giving it the serious thought it deserved, rather than dismissing it with an easy cynicism. Some people do. Some people take experiences like this, and use them as catalysts for change, for self-examination, for growth. Others just become more entrenched in their resentment, blaming everyone but themselves for the consequences of their actions. He shrugged slightly, the gesture containing both hope and realism. "Either way, he won't be in a position to treat our guests like that again." Emily nodded, satisfied with that knowledge, even if complete justice, the kind that changed hearts rather than merely constraining behavior, remained elusive. It was a pragmatic approach to progress. Hearts might follow actions, but actions could be required immediately. A staff member approached them hesitantly, clearly still adjusting to the new power dynamic in the hotel. She was middle-aged, her uniform pressed to perfection, her manner professional but warm. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson? We've prepared the presidential suite for you. And the executive team is available whenever you're ready to meet with them regarding the transition." The word transition carried weight and acknowledgement that what had occurred was not merely the firing of a manager but the beginning of institutional change. Michael thanked her with genuine warmth, then turned back to Emily. "Ready to head upstairs? You might want to change before dinner." He gestured to her still damp dress, concern evident in his expression. Emily smiled, the warmth finally reaching her eyes, thawing the last remnants of the ice that Richard's actions had momentarily placed there. "Actually, I think I'd like to stay in the lobby a bit longer." At Michael's questioning look, she explained, "I want them to see me here, comfortable and belonging. It matters." Michael understood immediately. It wasn't about pride or proving a point. It was about visibility. About occupying space confidently to make it easier for the next person. About refusing to be driven away, to become invisible, to accommodate bigotry by removing oneself from its path. It was its own form of resistance, quiet but profound. "Then let's have a drink right here," he said, guiding her toward the hotel's elegant lobby bar, a space designed with the same opulence as the rest of the Belmont Grand, dark polished wood, brass fixtures, and plush seating. As they walked, staff members nodded respectfully, not with the fear they had shown Richard Bennett, but with genuine deference rooted in admiration rather than intimidation. They selected a table with a view of the entire lobby, a position that allowed them to be seen while also observing the subtle changes already beginning to manifest in the hotel's atmosphere. The bartender approached with a warmth that felt genuine rather than performative, taking their order with attentive efficiency. Emily sat with perfect posture, her chin held high, refusing to let the incident diminish her in any way. The water that had dripped from her face earlier had dried, leaving no visible trace of the humiliation Richard had intended to inflict. In its place was a quiet dignity that no amount of discrimination could diminish, a presence that commanded respect not through domination but through an unshakable sense of self-worth. As if on cue, the rain outside began to subside, and the first hints of evening sunlight broke through the clouds. It streamed through the lobby's massive windows, catching in the crystal chandeliers and scattering prismatic light across the marble floors. The same chandeliers that had witnessed Emily's humiliation now cast their glow on her triumph. The same marble that had received the droplets of water from her face now reflected the determined set of her shoulders, the serene confidence of her expression. Throughout the lobby, conversations continued, business was conducted, life moved forward. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the Belmont Grand. A message had been sent, not through memos or policy documents, but through decisive action. Everyone deserves respect. Everyone belongs. Power, when abused, can be taken away. These truths rippled outward from the evening's events, touching each person present in ways that would continue long after the immediate drama had faded from memory. Michael reached across the table and took Emily's hand in his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture both intimate and supportive. No words were necessary between them. They had faced countless variations of this scenario throughout their lives, would likely face more in the future. The work of creating a more just world was never complete, never finished, always requiring vigilance and courage. But in this moment, in this place, they had stood their ground. And that was enough for today. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own challenges, but also its own opportunities for progress. In the warm glow of the chandeliers, Emily's eyes shone with unshed tears, not of sadness or anger, but of something more complex and ultimately more powerful. Hope, perhaps. Or determination. Or simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails. Not perfect justice, not complete justice, but enough to sustain the continuing struggle for a world where dignity is not determined by power, where respect is not contingent on status, where humanity is recognized in everyone regardless of appearance or position. As they sipped their drinks, a soft piano melody drifted from somewhere in the lobby, a hopeful tune that seemed to perfectly capture the moment's blend of reflection and renewal. Outside, the last rays of sun transformed puddles from the earlier downpour into mirrors reflecting the emerging stars. Inside, in the heart of the Belmont Grand, a small but significant transformation had begun. A ripple that would expand outward in ways that neither Michael nor Emily could fully predict, but both were committed to nurturing. This, after all, was the work they had chosen, not just professional success, not just personal achievement, but the slow, often difficult labor of making the world more just, one moment, one decision, one stand at a time.